Hotep, I'm Dr. Gloria Lattimore Peace, host and producer of OmniU Presents the H3O Art of Life show. The title of this show is called Can You Imagine? And the reason I have given it that title is because my guest, Hunter Havlin Adams III, very often talks about the stories, about the four stories. The stories he will talk about today, among other things. But in order to be able to create stories and tell stories, you have to imagine what those stories are intended to do, the purpose of those stories, the content of those stories, the elements of those stories. And if you cannot imagine your own story, then it is very likely that you are not living your own story, but you are living a story that has been imagined by someone else. So I wanted Hunter to talk to us about the four stories, about framing, about consciousness, about a conference that he's going to participate in whichever order he likes to talk about those things.
Well, thank you again for having me on your show. I feel always so grateful to have this opportunity to reach your viewers, your long-term viewers over a decade and more. And so you've cultivated a wonderful, intelligent audience over the years who enjoy you and enjoy your guests because you always have interesting people, and it's an honor to be considered as one of those many, many people that you've had on, many amazing people that you've had on throughout the years. You know, looking at stories, um, human beings, perhaps the thing that really, really separates us from other mammals, and we can't say it's DNA. That's not a big deal because we share 99% DNA with certain chimpanzee species. We share DNA with coral reefs and sponges, sea sponges. But obviously, you know, we're very different from all of them. It's not that human beings have culture, because we know from a lot of the research that's been done over decades that many other mammals have culture too. You know, dolphins have culture. Recently, there was a pod of 10,000 dolphins, you know, off the coast of San Diego, just frolicking and having a great time in the water. Where they were going, what they were doing, what they were communicating, you know, we don't know, but they were there. Even birds have culture. So culture is not a defining feature of what makes us unique in the living kingdom. Well, maybe I shouldn't even use kingdom, in the living world, because it's not a king. There's no ruler over it, right? So the thing that really separates us is our narrative mind. We tend not to think about it, but our lives are a story. Our history is framed in terms of stories, of different storytellers telling stories or versions of the same story for themselves and for other people. And so we're living in stories. Anyone who participates in any organized religion knows very well they're immersed in a story of someone, of an Old Testament prophet, or Prophet Muhammad, or the Buddha, whoever it may be, or Osiris and Aset and Heru and Seth, or the Dogon and the Nomos, everyone is embedded, live their lives according to the calendar, the time frame of a story. And that story oftentimes becomes living, it's alive. But because we weren't there when the story originated, we're really living a myth. And myth isn't a bad word. Joseph Campbell certainly demonstrated that years ago in his
The Power of
The
Myth.
Power of Myth videos, still valuable today. The composer, musician, Sun Ra asked the question, if you are not a reality, then whose myth are you?
And if
If
you are
you
not
are
a
not a
myth,
reality, then whose myth are you? And if you're
if
not
you're
a
a
myth, then whose
whose
reality
reality?
are you? Simple but profound, because we're living inside of myths, inside of stories, Dr. Peace. Stories that's been constructed over thousands of years. And it's the same kind of story. People are upset with Quentin Tarantino, who won an Oscar for Best Screenplay for his movie Django Unchained, that it's a terrible story. It does a egregious injustice to the memory of Africans who survived torture and terrible things on those plantations. But he was retelling a story. And the story wasn't about slavery. The story was a Germanic Norse myth about Brunhilde. And that same myth has been retold and added to and expanded by people over time in Europe and elsewhere. There's a cartoon, a comic book called Broomhilda. you know, so he just expanded on that. And so that movie, above all, was a hero's journey film. To rescue his beloved, he had to go through hell to do that. He had to fight dragons, but these weren't the mythical dragons of Norse tales. These were dragons with guns and with whips and other things to wreak havoc on the conscience and the bodies of the people. And so that's what that movie was. It was a hero's journey, where this person who was seemingly unworthy, unfit for the task, meets someone who then trains him, who teaches him how to read, how to shoot a weapon, how to act, which was the most important thing that he did, how to play a role. And remember, you're not the role that you're playing. And that's one of the things that we forget, is that we're caught up in all these different stories and we're really just acting, because it's not our story. It's not your story. There was a wonderful article in the Huffington Post, 2008, during the time of the first campaign by Barack Obama for president. And it was during the primary season, and he wasn't doing very well. A lot of things was going on, and a lot of stuff was happening with the former Secretary of State, with Hillary Clinton, a lot of divisions in the Democratic base on who they were going to support and why. And so a political psychologist by the name of Drew Weston Drew Weston, author of a book called The Political Brain, where he looks at politics in terms of how people's brains function, how they evaluate things, what forms of emotion do they ascribe to things that different parties say. Republicans will have one set of emotions when a Democrat says something, and a Democrat will have another set when a Republican says something. And so he wrote this article for the Huffington Post in 2008. You can Google it on the Huffington Post. And he said that Barack Obama doesn't have control over all four stories. I said, that's interesting, all four stories. And so he broke it down. In order to win, he has to control the messaging in all four of these stories. The first story is a story you tell yourself to yourself about yourself. And that's typically all the wonderful things that you've done, all your accomplishments, your visions, your goals, right? That's what you want to tell to yourself because you need that positive feedback. Your supporters need to have something to go on. It's why they want to support you. And so they want to hear all the wonderful things so they can pass that all around to their friends. Then there's story number two. Story number two is the story you tell yourself about your opponent. And your opponent can be someone from the other political party. It can be a competitor if you are a business. It could be an adversary. It could be someone from another religious tradition, someone from a different ethnic group, or someone from a, quote, different racial group. It could be someone who is beating you down. So that's who your opponent would be. That's story number two, because you have to tell yourself a story about them, because you got to reconcile their behavior and how that can move you forward. Story number three is the story your opponent tells themselves about themselves to themselves. So just like you, they're the best thing since sliced bread, right? Because they got to build themselves up. You listen to Republicans, they build themselves up, that they can do no wrong, that we have the right position on everything. Then there's story number four, and that's the story your opponent tells themselves about you to themselves. So you have these four stories. And the president at that time really only had control over, in terms of the media, of stories 1 and 2 about him and about his opponent. But he wasn't suggesting a narrative for his opponent that could stick. Oh yeah, he could talk about, Hillary Clinton, but he was being very careful in talking about Secretary Clinton, because she was a woman, and you need women's votes, so you can't be too aggressive on her the way you would want to. So Drew Weston said he has to get control over the message grid, those four, all stories, because when you do, you control the backstory, which informs all the other stories, because the backstory brings history into the mix. It brings contingency. It brings other relationships that all the parties have had over years, decades, even centuries, depending upon who the actors are in the story. And so that backstory then forms the grand narrative the grand narrative with which all the players are participants in. But the grand narrative wasn't the president's story. He had a different narrative. He was raised differently. He was raised in Hawaii, that has remnants still today of this high ethical culture, from the indigenous Hawaiians. And then he went to Indonesia to live for a period of time, completely away from the stories of the United States for a good time period. So he missed growing up in this story. And so now you're going to compete within this grand narrative. And so you need people who can help shape you and to get control over, or at least influence, these other two stories, the stories of your opponent, what they say about you and what they say to themselves about themselves, to get them to believe what you say about them, or to get the undecideds to believe that, to sway their opinion. And so the four stories are important for African people, particularly in the United States, really in the northern and southern hemispheres, of what we call America, including Central America as well, is because our stories were cut off and we found ourselves immersed in a European story, a European mind, a European ideas about life, about ethics, about morality, about treating people right, and so forth. And it was totally alien, totally alien. We knew nothing about their story, nothing about their history. Couldn't develop contingency plans on how to mitigate against the onslaught that was to come, because we just didn't know their story. And because we didn't know their story, we couldn't define them for us and define them for them. And so we've been trapped in their grand narrative ever since 1442. And that was a time shortly after Vasco da Gama circumnavigated the continent of Africa and went on. And the Portuguese began their mission to bring Africans back to Portugal to work, to boost their economy,
To serve them.
to serve them. And they said, wow, this is good. Here, we got a good thing going. We got a good thing going. And so then they sought the blessing of the church at the time to, quote, enslave these Africans for all time, for all eternity. It's written down. A papal bull's issued. And that was the beginning of being caught up in somebody else's story. And we're still in their story, living in their story. It doesn't matter if you are an African in America, United States, or an African in Zimbabwe. Doesn't matter, because you're still caught up in their story and in their system, in their worldview. So even though, various ethnic groups have their own traditions, their own stories, but the grand narrative, they still are controlling the message grid. We're still perceived as less than we are, unworthy, and a whole host of negative connotations concerning people of African descent, we who are darker than blue, as Curtis Mayfield would say. And so it's unfortunate that many people have bought into that. And not just Africans who are using bleaching creams to become other than who they are in Africa, in China, in India, because of the story. And you can't convince people off the top that what you're doing, you're defacing yourself. You're debasing yourself. The universe allowed you to come into existence in the form that you have. That's a great blessing, a tremendous great blessing. 1 in 300 million sperm, and here you are. And so you're going to deface that because of the perception of beauty that's being programmed into you, into your culture, because you don't have control over the story to stop that. And they don't know how to stop that. And so their lives are framed. They're framed, they're not their own. In the movie Cloud Atlas, which I still think is a great movie, even though it didn't win any awards or wasn't even nominated, still think it was a great film. Complex, it was. Hard to follow, it was on the first go. The second go, if you see it a second time, then things make sense. And one of the key lines was, our lives are not our own. This isn't mine. I can't claim this body that I'm in. It's a gift. It's a gift to allow me, to allow you and your viewers to experience what a living spiritual life is. But when it's defined and limited by other stories, then we all come up short. That's why we see so much tragedy. One of the reasons why we see so much tragedy and violence in our communities, and hopelessness and helplessness, despite not having jobs, is because people don't have anything to live for. So particularly young brothers, notwithstanding being profoundly influenced by images and sounds that they see and hear, why would someone name their group mindless behavior? Where did that come from? From watching Beavis and Butthead and The Simpsons, where the whole objective of the characters was to be belligerent, to talk back to your parents, to berate your parents, to curse your parents out. They learned that watching those shows. And Jackass, they want to know, where does it come from? Why do we see this craziness, these flash mobs? And that's just in Chicago recently. But they're all over the country, even in rural areas, because they come up looking at the same stuff too. And so you have writers who are competing with one another, who can be more stupid. To call the 9-year-old girl a word that rhymes with a football activity, punt, was despicable. You don't talk about children like that unless you're talking about your own like that, and they probably do. But we have to look where this stuff is coming from. We have to figure out, how do we get control over our grand narrative? We need another grand narrative. And for that, we have to practice the second principle of Kwanzaa, Kujichagulia, self-determination. We have to determine what works for us. If it works for someone else, fine. If it doesn't work for the opposition, that's fine. But we have to find ways to gain control over the narrative. I am not a minority. You don't think you're a minority?
Absolutely not. Not when 9/10 of the people in the world are people of color. How can I be a
I'm not
part
a
of a
minority.
minority?
And that's what happens, is that we're not in a post-racial society. That is a delusion. When everything is configured around black, white, and others, everything. You know, whether you're applying for a job or applying for some health care benefits. What race are you? Because they want to track to make sure, I think this might be a conspiracy to make sure that black folks are doing bad. Right? Oh, we can't see. Oh, wow, the gap is narrowing. Oh, we got to institute some more policies to bring that gap wider again. Oh, 3 strikes are out. Okay, we'll eliminate that and mandatory minimums. We got to do something else to keep the levels of incarceration up. Right? Got to figure out other ways to maintain
Other names to
the
call them.
status quo, so you create other names and other programs. Oh, California, oh, we got to release all these people. We can't pay for them to be in prison anymore. Or we have to find something else to do. Build more prisons, then ship them to Illinois. Got a maximum security prison that's still vacant. Got to find something for them, some place for them to go. And so people are moving around. Oh, the economy is bad. We got to do something to compete with the Chinese. Oh, I got a great idea. Let's have the inmates do more than stamp license plates. They can build furniture, they can build computers, and we can pay them 13 cents an hour. That's much better than the Chinese, and we don't have to give them any health benefits either. Oh, the exclusion, the 13th Amendment. Oh, that's right. If you're convicted of a crime, well, then slavery still applies to you. You're not a citizen. So it's a story. It's a story. We have to gain control over this story. We have to learn more about how our minds work so we're not manipulated, particularly our youth, because so many of them don't have a clue. They're just wandering aimlessly about the world and just don't know. They can't see because they've been miseducated again. But their miseducation has been fine-tuned to reap the results of ignorance for an entire generation. I was at a cell phone company. I'm not going to mention their name because I wouldn't have very much to say about them. That's good. But I called them up and said my cell phone, the battery was spontaneously drained. And, so I took it back and they said, well, you got to take it to the warranty department. So I go downtown Chicago to the warranty department, and there was a young guy, probably in his mid-30s, and he says, well, we have to test it out. Do you have anything on your phone, any picture? I said, yes, I do. He said, well, you have to take those off. We can't take them off here. He said, you can do the test at home, but you still have to bring it back here. I said, well, there's no point in me doing the test at home to bring it back. So I come back the next day, and he reset the phone, and he In the store, he shot some video because I said there was a video problem along with the battery problem, and the video seemed to work in the store. He said, well, it seems to be working now. I said, that's the video, sir. It still has a Wi-Fi issue and a battery issue. Well, since it's been reset, why don't you just go home and see how it works for a few days, and if it has any more problems, then bring it back. I said, sir, I did that today. I'm here today. He said, we can't give you another phone if there's nothing wrong with it. I said, well, there is something wrong with it. I did the research, and the research does say that there is something characteristic about this phone that the company has not fixed. I said, and I'm going to hear Dr. Lerone Bennett tonight, and I wanted to document, because he's in his 80s, his conversation, because he's going to be talking about the 13th Amendment, Django, and Emancipation Proclamation. And the young guy said, well, who is Lerone Bennett? I held my breath. I said, he's a writer. He wrote Before the Mayflower and a bunch of other books. His last one was Lincoln Forced into Glory, about Lincoln and what he was forced to do. He didn't want to emancipate certain African populations who were held against their will. He said, I never heard of him, never heard of those books. I said, well, he was a senior editor for Ebony magazine. Never heard of Ebony magazine. I said, wow. Wow. He said, well, Django was a great movie. There was a lot of truth in Django. I said, there was a lot of problems with Django Unchained. And I was just aghast. Here's someone in Chicago who never heard of Lerone Bennett, in his mid-30s, never heard of Before the Mayflower, never even heard of Ebony magazine, and you're in Chicago. Now, maybe he came from someplace else, but where can you go in the United States of America, in the Caribbean, and not know Ebony magazine exists? Because he was caught up in somebody else's story. That's where we're at.
Well, when I read Facing Mount Kenya by Jomo Kenyatta, when I was starting to work on my master's degree, one of the things that struck me was the story that the Kikuyu people told themselves, and they called it a legend, not a myth. And they said, according to the tribal legend, the Ngai or the Mogai created Mumbi and her mate, and gave them Kikuyu land with all of the good things in nature, and told them to go forward and to raise their family. And they had 9 daughters, but no sons. So they went to Mount Kenya, and they were given sons. But the 9 clans were all female-based clans, and so they were matriarchal. But what I'm saying is that the presumption that they got from the stories that they told themselves about themselves, and the stories that they told themselves about others, was that everyone, not just themselves, had a creator who created them and gave them a land to inhabit, gave them a home, gave them a land to inhabit, full of all the good things of nature, gave them everything that they needed, but also instructed them that if they had need of anything else, all they had to do was return and ask for what was needed, and that would be given. And there weren't conditions and what have you. But this was the story that they told themselves for thousands of years before they ever saw a non-Gikuyu, well, not a non-Gikuyu, but ever saw a European. And they presumed that the Europeans who came among them had their own lands to which they were anxious to return, and were just traveling among them. They could not imagine a diabolical scheme in which people would come among the people to look for opportunities and advantages and weaknesses that they might exploit in order to take control of the land and the people. They simply that was not a part of their story. Right. They lived with other people, and they didn't call these people by races. They called the people, some people were the forest dwellers. Others were the people who lived by the sea. Other people were the people who hunt. They identified people by significant things about the people, none of which had to do with physical attributes, always having to do with the way they lived. So when the Europeans came, well, they didn't come without the Gikuyu knowing they were coming, because their medicine man had a dream, and he told them that creatures with light-colored bodies would come out of the big water bearing sticks that spit fire. And they were not to fight these people. So they knew when the Europeans showed up, they knew, and that also that they would build a great iron snake. That's what the medicine man told them. So when the Europeans came among them and started to build the railroad through their land, all of the things that were happening were anticipated, and they observed what was going on. But they still could not conceptualize that these people came to settle, that these people came to stay, and not to live as the forest dwellers and the people who live by the sea, or the people who fish, or the people who hunt, but came to be the people who captured the people who were already there. So the stories that people tell themselves can often be deficient. They can include a lot of elements, useful elements, because they have the creation story. They have the elements. But the missing element is that there are some people who, despite the fact that they have been given a land full of all the good things of nature, are not satisfied with only having the land that they have been given, but they have an eye toward possessing all of the land and all of the good things of nature anywhere and everywhere they can have access to. And sometimes I think there must be a fifth story. And it's not just the story that the people tell themselves about themselves and the people, what they tell themselves about other people. Because the Gikuyu clearly didn't tell themselves enough of the elements about other people. But there's also that story that other people tell other people about you. In other words, in order to get public opinion on their side, they
Right.
not only tell themselves and about you, but they badmouth you all over the planet so that other people will share their story about you. And that must be what you're calling the backstory.
Right.
They get that story together so that their story about you becomes the global story about
Right.
you. And it is very difficult for you to overcome it, especially if you are missing a part of your story is missing that second element, which is what you are telling yourself
Right.
about these people who are telling the world about you, giving you bad press, or
Right.
or
Right.
falsifying your image, falsifying your reputation to the rest of the world, so that you have not even met these people yet. But
They already know about you when you get
whenever
there.
they encounter you, they already know. When people sometimes come here and they want to become American citizens, sometimes they are more racist in their behavior toward people of color who already live here than the people who live here already,
Right.
because they have heard the story and they have bought the story. And so, there are those black people, there are those people who have all of these negative attributes.
Right.
There are
We
these people
believe
to
it.
be feared, there are these people to be renounced, there are these people to be avoided, there are these people to annihilate. There
To
are these
not
people.
trust.
There are these people to turn into the Trayvon Martins of the world, because the story has been embraced and you don't have
It's
to have your
embedded.
own experience
Right.
with the people, because you already know them. You already know who they are, and it doesn't matter. There aren't any exceptions to the rule. It's better to be safe than sorry. We're suffering that. We're suffering that. We're missing the second element of our story, and we're missing that backstory.
And what happens often, the backstory becomes the religious story that people are in that rather than celebrating, even aspiring to a larger history of African people pre-1441, 42, it gets transferred into the religious story that people are into.
The Hamitic myth.
They find themselves, pre that date, suddenly now we're going to follow this religious story. And so the rest of the story of African people, as diverse as they are and have always been, is lost, is given a short shrift, even during African American History Month. Even though the state of Illinois has legislated that African American history be taught in all public schools in the entire state, it's not being done. And teachers and others aren't demanding that it be done, despite the budgets, because our story should be included. Because so many people, as the man at the phone store, don't know. Whatever you may say about Django, it exposed an entire generation to some of the torture that African people experienced during that time period. Not all of it, but some of it. Was Mandingo fighting real? Did they really sick dogs on people to kill them? Of course, anyone can do just a little bit of research and find that to be true. It may not have been called Mandingo fighting, but were there fightings like the old days in the Roman Colosseum, the gladiators? People are looking at what is it, street fighting that's beyond wrestling now, where people are pummeling other people for sport and getting paid. So why wouldn't there have been that type of fighting on the plantations? Oh no, it couldn't have been, because that would have been a bad investment. It was entertainment. They were betting, right? To see who had the stronger person. So that's what that was. And it still continues today. Maybe not with that level of brutality that's televised, but you do have those games like the dog fighting that take place in small communities or a small circle of people that are hidden, that you don't know about it, but it exists today. So we lost the continuity of our story. And we have to reclaim that continuity that isn't discussed. All this, just about every slave movie starts with someone being captured, if they start there, not from the cultures that they had prior to that. You know, that's framing the story, that your history, your beingness began here, not before that. You don't have a history. You're a nothing. And so sometimes in the 60s, you see people holding up a sign, I am a man. Well, it's obviously, if I look at you, you're a man. Why do you have to hold up a sign? Because in someone else's story, you're not. And it still comes about over and over again in many ways today. So we have to gain control over that story. And that's one of the things that I'm going to be talking about in an upcoming book that I'm doing. And I think that they want to roll a trailer.
Well, they should roll the trailer.
We'll see if it's coming on.
So now we are going to have a great storyteller give us another narrative, start us on our way toward another narrative. And there is a purpose. We understand the purpose of this narrative is to liberate us from somebody else's myth so that we don't have to be somebody else's myth, but that we can be our own reality. Talk to us for the time that we have remaining about your upcoming book, We Were Never Slaves.
Well, it's something, my background, of recent days is in cultural neuroscience or social neuroscience research. I've gone to London to school, but I put on many different hats, and an early hat was that of someone who appreciated history. Studied with, many people, with Dr. Asa Hilliard, Bobby Wright, Dr. Anderson Thompson, and Dr. Jacob Carruthers, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, and many, many, many people who helped me to see what the frame was for our history and to present an alternative frame. And one of the things that we find is we're dealing with language. And language is really important. From studying neuroscience, there's specific areas in our brain that deal with language, mainly in the left hemisphere. And so ideas become embedded in our biology. We actually live them. We give life to the ideas because over time, they become part of us, that our identities are trapped in definitions that we take on and accept. Women, now it's fashionable for many women in television to say, yeah, I am a bee, right? You're a dog? That's how you think of yourself? And so this piece brings together a lot of things over the years that I've been working on. And it started as an idea that I gave a 5-minute talk at a Kwanzaa celebration, Chicago Area Health and Medical Careers Program, about 2007. I said we were never slaves. It was about self-determination. And there was a medical student there who said, well, would you come to our college, university, and during Black History Month and give us a talk? And so I did in Decatur, Illinois, and people really were stunned by the title. There was faculty and administrators there as well as students. And they said, this just doesn't make sense. We came because, we were wondering if you're going to be a denier that slavery never happened. But by the time I finished with them, they said, hey, this is good. This really makes sense. I never thought of it like that. And this is
liberating.
For them, for white people. Even trying to understand the linguistic origins of the word slave, for example. Yes, you can Google the word and you see that it's a connotation for the Slavic people, but they had their own terms for indentured servants, as did everyone else. They had their own terms, but it was translated. Someone took Slav, since many of them were indentured servants, and that's how we get slave.
We need to know 3 minutes.
And so there was a reverse translation that every time indentured servant came up in history, the word slave in English or a Slav in Spanish was inserted, going back to the Bible. But there were no Slavs in Palestine. They didn't exist. So there weren't slaves in Palestine. There were other indentured servants. And, the Hebrew names, I can't call them now. My partner and friend, Dr. Ben Levy, he can name that. But the point was, as I start looking at this deeper and looking at words mean, I said, we really were never slaves. In the video, it's hidden in plain sight who we are. And I'm not going to say now. You're going to have to read the book or catch me at a lecture. I might share that with you. But, and you can go to wewereneverslaves.com or hunteradams.org and to learn more. But it's going to really explode the story because it's dealing with our fundamental identity. That's a clue. Our fundamental identity. What are we?
Whose reality are we?
Whose reality are we? Whose reality was our ancestors?
What is our reality?
What were they? And if you really ponder that for a few moments, the answer will surprise you because it's right here. But because it's so obvious, we tend not to think about it. But children do. That's what I found. Children know immediately. They get it. As long as they're under 10. So that's what this is about. We were never slaves. Never, ever slaves. But in our experience was not slavery either. It was more than economic exploitation. Something much, much larger. And we'll discover that in the book.
I thank you so much, Hunter Haviland,
Well, thank you,
Adams
Dr.
III,
Peace.
for being so willing always to make it within your busy schedule to come and visit us and bring us your great insights because, revolutionize is a word that is much overused, but certainly we are going to have to have a radical revolution of the thought processes and the language that black people have been experiencing because we are not able to define our experience without doing so. And I thank you so much for your efforts on our behalf.
Well, thank you.
Hotep.
It's a wonderful blessing. And